My name is Jackson Myers, and this night was the worst nightmare of my life. I always thought that the city would be the most dangerous place, but that was before I got into the backwoods, a forest that hides more than just trees. And today, for the first time in many years, I feel that I am in the middle of something terrible. It all started with the fact that I decided to spend the night in nature, away from the hustle and bustle. My laptop and books needed a break, and I needed a rest. But in the forest, everything did not go as planned. I began to hear strange sounds that could not have come from the beasts. Steps? Whisper? It was getting worse. At night, when everything was quiet, I decided to check what exactly scared me. I approached the river where incomprehensible rustling could be heard. What I saw made my hands tremble. A notebook lay on the shore. Its pages were unfolded, and I noticed that the notebook contained notes made in various handwritings. My brain couldn't figure out what that meant. Several phrases caught my attention. He is always here watching over you, quiet and silent, as always. I felt a cold sweat running down my back. I couldn't leave this notebook here, so I hid it in my backpack and hurried back to camp. Then I noticed that something had changed in my camp. Only now I realized that all this was not a simple coincidence. I found out about it too late. In the morning, I woke up with a heavy feeling that hadn't let go of me since that night. The sky was gloomy, and the forest around seemed even more threatening. I decided to check the camp to see what might have changed, but I didn't find anything special. Everything looked as if nothing had happened. The notebook was in the backpack, and I took it in my hands. Before, I didn't pay much attention to what was written on its pages. Now I decided to look at the records in more detail. Most of the pages were filled with incomprehensible notes and drawings depicting a forest and some strange storage. But there were also such records that impressed me the most. For example, he always knows where you are. He starts hunting again. I tried to ask the locals about it when I got back to town, but no one knew anything about these records. People just waved it off and said it might be someone's stupid joke. But what if it's not a joke? What? How is it something more? I got home that evening and couldn't concentrate on work. I could feel my thoughts constantly returning to the notebook. Decided to check my email and saw that I had received several new messages. I started reading them, and suddenly one of the letters caught my attention. "You found my notebook. Now you know that I'm always there." My heart was pounding. How could anyone know about this? I looked at the letter again and saw the address, and it was an address I knew. It was the same area where I had left my car during my overnight stay in the woods. My heart beat even faster when I realized that someone had been watching me for a long time. A sense of horror and anxiety enveloped me. I didn't know if it was just a coincidence or if someone was trying to scare me. But one thing I knew for sure, this story is just beginning. The night was inhospitable. The wind drove the rain clouds, and every gust of wind seemed to be the cry of distant spirits. I could not sleep. All the time I felt that someone was watching me. As soon as I closed my eyes, I kept thinking about the notebook and who could be behind these terrible notes. In the morning, I decided to check the area around my house. I didn't notice anything special, except that the neighbor's dog barked loudly somewhere in the distance. I tried to calm myself down and decided to do some housework. When I left the house to buy some groceries, I ran into James, my neighbor from the house next door. He was gloomy and looked as if he had not slept all night. "James, are you okay?" I asked, trying to be polite, but at the same time watching his reaction with interest. Yeah, I'm fine. I just don't sleep well at night," he replied and tried to smile, but the smile was too strained. "I haven't slept either," I admitted. "I recently found something strange in the woods and now I can't rest." James looked at me and I saw something in his eyes that made me wary. There was something in his look that said he knew more than he wanted to admit. "Would you like to come in for coffee? Maybe it will help you take your mind off it," he suggested. And I, not wanting to say no, agreed. When we entered his house, the atmosphere was completely different. He had a large library of books as well as some strange items that looked like ancient artifacts. On the walls were pictures of people who looked as if their photos had been taken years ago. During the conversation, James tried to distract me from my worrying thoughts, but whenever I tried to start a conversation about the notebook or the night's events, he quickly changed the subject. I couldn't help but notice that he looked even more nervous when I thought about the night in the woods. After coffee, I decided it was time to go home. I thanked James and left. When I returned home, I felt that something had changed. My door was open again, even though I was sure I had closed it before leaving. On the doorstep, I found a small package with a note. "You are too curious. Now you better be more careful." My hands were shaking when I opened the package and found inside fragments of photographs that were parts of one large image. I tried to piece them together, but I had the impression that I was looking at something that should not be solved. 10 faces, each marked with fear, and among them I saw one familiar face, James. My heart beat even faster. I knew something very bad was coming, and it seems that James is part of that horrible puzzle. In the next few days, I tried to arrange my life, but the fear did not leave me. The notebook and the ominous fragments of the photos are constantly spinning in my head. I couldn't understand what was going on and why James could be involved in this horrible story. I decided to spend more time at home and try to find out what the secret is behind these photos. Nothing could distract me from these thoughts. I have spent hours trying to find out if I have any other clues, but none of my searches yielded results. One evening, while I was sitting at my desk, going over notes in my notebook, the doorbell made me jump. I carefully approached the door, and through the window I saw the same James standing in the doorway with a desperate look. "I need to talk to you," he said when I opened the door. His voice was anxious and uncertain. "What are you doing here? How do you know where I live?" I asked, trying not to show my fear. "You don't understand what's going on," James sighed and stepped inside as I passed him. "I know you found the records and photos. It's very dangerous." "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling the fear rising. "I have to tell you the truth," James began. "You've become a part of something that shouldn't concern you. There are people watching you, and it's not just a toy." He said that there is a secret organization that specializes in studying human fears and manipulating them. They use people as experimental subjects to observe their reactions to various stressful situations. James himself fell into their orbit many years ago and is now forced to help these people, albeit reluctantly. "I became a part of this hell myself, and now you are too," James continued. "You're part of their experiment. Those records you found are just part of what they're doing. You have to find a way to get out before it's gone." Late. I felt how all my efforts to become calm and rational were futile. My reality began to fall apart, and I realized that my situation was part of something much bigger and scarier. After talking with James, he left my apartment, but I already knew that I could not leave everything as it is. I had to find the answers on my own and discover who exactly was behind this nightmare and how to free myself from their chains. I took a notebook and fragments of photographs and went outside in search of traces. I felt that each step brought me closer to the answer, but also to new dangers. I spent a sleepless night thinking about everything I had learned from James. My thoughts were filled with fear and anxiety. In the morning, I headed to the library to find more information about the organization James mentioned. I was hoping I might come across something that would help me figure out how to get out of this trap. As I looked through old newspapers and archives, my hands began to shake. Each new fact seemed to add more darkness to an already hopeless situation. I learned about cases of disappearances in the area that were never solved. Many of these cases occurred many years ago, but it turns out that there is a connection between them. One of the most recent entries was an article about suspicious deaths in a nearby town. People were found dead under strange circumstances, and all the witnesses talked about strange noises at night. But no one could explain what really happened. I unfolded the map and marked the places of disappearances and events. I was convinced that this organization had something to do with these deaths. The more I thought about it, the more connections and possible paths that could lead to the solution appeared. My plan was simple. I would go to the places where the most suspicious incidents had taken place and try to find any clues that could help unravel what was behind these deaths. After I embarked on my journey, I felt that all my fears were becoming more real. I drove through small towns where I visited the places that were described in the articles. I noticed that some of these places looked very old and neglected. As a rule, they were overgrown with grass and covered with dust. In one such place, an old warehouse, I came across something that made my heart beat faster. I found preserved boxes of personal belongings of people who had disappeared. While I was going through these things, I found a badly damaged folder containing photos and records related to missing persons. Another find was an old journal in which the dates and places of disappearances were recorded. The last page was particularly interesting. It contained a map on which various points were marked, clearly showing the places for future experiments. I had the feeling that I was on the threshold of a great discovery, and that my further steps could lead me to the truth or to even greater danger. I left the warehouse with my heart beating in the rhythm of fear and hope. With the old magazine in hand, I started back to my car, feeling the weight of each step. My thoughts were filled with the information I found. I think I've hit a trail that leads to something much more than just random disappearances. My next goal was to learn more about these points on the map, marked as potential places for experiments. I decided to go back home and look at all the records and maps to better understand how these dots were connected. This was critical to finding out if there was a particular logic or pattern to the choice of locations. When I got home, I felt that something was wrong. My phone kept ringing, but when I answered, there was only silence. The feeling of danger was already on the verge of panic. I checked the incoming data, and several of them were from unknown numbers. One of the messages was particularly disturbing. "You've gone too far. If you don't stop, it will be too late." I tried to ignore it and focus on the map. With each viewing, I marked the places where the events took place and tried to find out if there were any connections between them. I noticed that many of these places were about 15 miles apart, creating a pattern. Examining the map, I came across one particularly mysterious region labeled Point X. This point did not correspond to any of the previously found locations and seemed strange. I decided that this could be the key to solving the whole situation. The next day I went to Point X. It was deep in the forest, far from any normal routes or human settlements. As soon as I arrived, I noticed that the forest looked different, darker and more threatening. I watched the darkness that gradually filled the space, and I felt that danger was approaching. I got out of the car again and started exploring the area. The forest looked abandoned, and the trees seemed to turn into dark silhouettes. Suddenly, I came across an old, abandoned house. It was partially destroyed and looked as if it had been abandoned for a long time. Gathering all my courage, I decided to go inside. I opened the creaking door and stepped into the darkness. It was eerily quiet inside, and the air was heavy and filled with the smell of mold. My flashlight illuminated the rooms, and I noticed tracks leading to the basement. I carefully went down. The basement was dark and looked like it was being used as a warehouse for something. I found several shelves filled with old crates and boxes. Among them, I came across several documents that looked new compared to the others. I began to look through these documents and realized that they were records of experiments similar to those described in the journal. It seemed that these documents were part of some large project involving psychological and physical experiments on humans. Suddenly, I heard a noise and my heart stopped. It seemed that someone else was in the house. I went back to the stairs, but before I could get out, I heard sounds approaching. I could feel my fear peaking. Something was close, and the danger seemed very real. I hurried out of the basement, feeling every nerve in my body tense. I turned to the sound that was still echoing in the darkness and tried to quickly get out of the house. The sense of urgency was almost physical as my heart was beating at a frantic pace. Coming out into the light, I remembered the documents I had left in the basement. It might be important, but I couldn't stay there a minute longer. I got into my car and sped back into town, trying to process what I saw. My mind couldn't dwell on one thought. Why was someone in the house, and what did that mean for me? I tried to contact James, but he did not answer. This only reinforced my fears. After returning home, I began to review the documents that I managed to collect. They contained records of experiments conducted, dates and places, as well as personal data of people who became their victims. I found a name that caught my attention: Michael Sanders. He was listed as one of the key organizers of the project, and his name appeared frequently in the reports. This name was familiar to me. Looking at other records, I realized that Michael Sanders had a reputation as a missing scientist who worked on questionable experiments. It also explained why he was listed in all the reports. I decided that I should learn more about him and try to contact him if possible. I turned to the old archives and found an address associated with Michael Sanders. It was an old empty house on the outskirts of town. I headed there hoping to find some clues about what had happened to him and maybe how to stop it. The house looked even worse than I could have imagined. The windows were boarded up. The doors were cracked. I carefully opened the door and went inside. The atmosphere inside was even more oppressive than in the basement. Everything was covered in dust and cobwebs and looked as if no one had been here for a long time. I started checking the rooms. In one of them, I came across an old table on which lay a pile of papers and photographs. These were records and pictures that testified to the numerous experiments that were conducted here. I found another notebook very similar to the one I found earlier. It contained records of people participating in the experiments and schematics for future tests. My state of anxiety reached a tipping point when I found personal photos of Michael Sanders in various locations with the victims that had been flagged in the reports. With each new photo found, more and more darkness and horror was revealed. Suddenly, I heard a noise from another part of the house. It seemed that someone was approaching. I tried to find a safe place, but the door I came through was already closed. I could feel every sound increasing my sense of dread. I needed to find a way out, but I realized it might be too late. I began to look for a way out, but every sound and every shadow seemed threatening. In the darkness, I realized that I might not be alone in this house. My heart was beating faster, and I knew I had to find a way out before it was too late. I felt fear grip my heart, and every sound in the house seemed an echo of danger. I decided the safest thing to do would be to go back to the exit and try to find a way to leave this place. But the house seemed to have plans of its own. I felt like my every move was being watched, and every attempt I made to find a way out could fail. I began to move slowly and carefully through the house, trying not to make any noise. The old floor creaked under my feet, and I tried to ignore its sounds. I ran through the rooms again, hoping to find a less dangerous way out. My anxiety peaked when I saw that the door I had previously entered was now closed. It was as if someone had locked them on purpose to prevent me from leaving. My fingers trembled as I tried to open the door, but it was locked. I was trying to understand how I got into such a trap. Suddenly, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching from the darkness. I quickly hid behind an old closet and listened. The footsteps stopped for a few minutes and then started moving again. I could feel the presence of someone else in this house, and it was eerie. I decided that the only chance to get out was to explore the basement again. Maybe there is some other way out, or a clue that will help me get out. I carefully made my way down to the basement, paying close attention to the sounds around me. The basement was dark and musty, but I found an old, dusty refrigerator. I wondered what might be inside. I opened the fridge, and inside I found some old containers of food, but also some new folders and documents. I picked up one of the folders and saw that it contained detailed reports of the experiments and the names of the victims. However, among the documents I found another name, Gregory Foster. His name was written with special attention. Nearby was a date that coincided with the most recent disappearances. I realized that Gregory Foster might be the key to solving all of this. I needed to know more about him. I found a record of his last address and decided that might be my next destination. When I went upstairs again, I noticed that some of the windows were broken. I understood that someone or something could not be far away. I started to climb out through the broken window, trying to be careful and quick. My nerves were on edge, but I had to get to Gregory Foster's address to figure out what was going on. Returning to the car, I set out for the new address, trying to ignore the sense of haunting that had become my constant companion. I could not allow myself to be distracted by fears. My goal was clear, and I had to find out what exactly was hidden behind these terrible experiments. I arrived at Gregory Foster's address, which turned out to be in an old, run-down neighborhood on the outskirts of town. The house I found looked like it had been abandoned for a long time. The windows were boarded up, and the garden around the house was overgrown with thick grass and weeds. Everything around looked abandoned and unfriendly. I went to the door and tried to find out if they had any signs of life. I rang the doorbell, but there was no answer. I figured I'd better check the backyard to see if there were any clues. The backyard also looked neglected. I walked around the house and came across a small garage that was separate from the main house. The garage door was slightly open. I carefully opened them and went inside. The garage was filled with old tools covered in dust and rust. Continuing to search the garage, I came across boxes in which various documents were kept. I started looking through them and realized that they were technical notes and reports related to experiments. Some of these documents contained diagrams, drawings, and records of tests conducted. One of the boxes caught my eye. It contained photographs of people who looked as if they had been taken during experiments. Many of them looked terrible, and I could see that these people were in terrible condition. I suddenly felt that someone was watching me. I looked around but saw nothing. My anxiety increased, and I decided the best thing to do would be to leave the garage and go back to the car. But as soon as I started to leave, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw a shadow quickly approaching me. I could not clearly recognize who it was, but I felt that it was something very threatening. I quickly jumped to the car and tried to start the engine, but it would not respond. My hands were shaking, and I could feel the fear preventing me from acting. Finally, the engine started, and I pulled out of the yard. I headed to the nearest coffee shop where I could find a place to think and try to learn more about Gregory Foster. I found a small coffee shop nearby and ordered a coffee. As I sat at the table, I continued to go through the documents I found in the garage. According to recent reports, Gregory Foster has been mentioned as one of the main researchers working on research in the field of psychological manipulation and behavior control. His name also appeared in the context of several unexplained disappearances that occurred in different parts of the country. The more I read, the more I realized that Gregory Foster could be an important part of this network. My next goal was to find any connections between Gregory Foster and Michael Sanders. Perhaps this will help to find out exactly where these experiments are and how I can stop them. I knew I had to act fast to solve all these puzzles before it was too late. My thoughts were filled with fear and confusion, but I couldn't let myself stop. I was sure that something even more terrible and dangerous was behind these terrible experiments. My next step was to go to the city archives and try to find even more information about Gregory Foster and his activities. After a busy night at the coffee shop, I headed to the city archives, hoping to find more information about Gregory Foster and his activities. The archives were located in an old building near the city center. It was a huge and silent building with heavy wooden doors that looked as if its history was steeped in mystery. I went inside and went to the registration desk. The archives officer was engrossed in his papers, and I asked him about the possibility of getting access to the old records. He looked at me curiously, but immediately agreed to help. "I'm looking for information on Gregory Foster and his possible activities," I said, trying to remain calm. "Perhaps there are records of his activity or documents related to him." The officer noted something in his journal and led me to the department where the old files were kept. He showed me a large rack of documents dating back several decades. I started looking through the docs, trying to find something that might be helpful. I came across several articles and newspaper clippings that mentioned Gregory Foster. It turned out that he was famous in scientific circles for his work in the field of psychology and neurophysiology. But over time, his name disappeared from publications, and it was very suspicious. One of the articles caught my attention. It contained a reference to a series of studies conducted in remote laboratories. The article stated that these laboratories were closed and their operations were terminated due to ethical violations. I decided to check these laboratories in more detail. I found records of a laboratory located deep in the forest, not far from where I had been before. It was a body of communication that connected all the scattered points on the map. I decided to head there, hoping to find more tracks. I returned to the car and drove to the forest, to the laboratory mentioned in the documents. The forest looked calm, but it was an illusory calm. I made my way through the thick trees and eventually came upon another old house similar to the one I visited earlier. This house looked newer, but also run down. As I got closer, I saw that the door was half open. I carefully went inside and noticed that the inside was clean and didn't seem to have been abandoned for so long. The place looked like it had been used recently. I started checking the rooms and came across more documents. Among them, I found records of tests and experiments conducted on people. Here's what was most frightening. The records showed that the experiments were aimed at manipulating consciousness and controlling behavior, and they involved serious psychological trauma. I found another important detail. a list of people who were involved in the project, and among them was the name Michael Sanders. This confirmed my suspicions about the connection between Sanders and Foster. I also found a map that marked several locations associated with the experiments. Suddenly I heard a sound that made me freeze. It was footsteps approaching. I quickly hid behind the furniture and tried to be as quiet as possible. The footsteps became louder, and I felt that danger was near. I realized that something or someone was watching me, and my stay here became very dangerous. I needed to find a way out before they found me. I began to carefully leave the house, keeping to the shadows and trying not to make any sound. After getting outside, I got into the car and quickly drove out of the forest. I knew I had to act fast, and the next step was to check all the places marked on the map. I was sure it would help me figure out where the main base of experiments might be and how I could stop them. Back in the city, I tried to regain my composure and focus on my next steps. I took a map with notes and began to plan my actions. Each mark on the map represented a potential object where experiments could be conducted. I decided to start with the closest place and check it out. The first place was not far from the old warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It was a large and derelict room that seemed never to have been used. I arrived there early in the morning when it was still dark. I carefully checked the area and found a few signs of human activity. The tracks led to one of the back entrances. I entered the warehouse and began to check it out. The interior was filled with old boxes and equipment, but I also found some interesting finds. Among the garbage, I came across documents indicating the transportation of goods and people. The site appears to have been used as a warehouse for experimental equipment and materials. After a thorough search of the warehouse, I decided to move on to the next location on the map. It was an old farmhouse located outside of town. I reached him late in the evening. The house looked even more neglected than the previous one, and looked as if it had not been visited in a long time. I carefully went inside and found even more documents and records related to the experiments. Among the papers, I found several notes about attendance at scientific conferences and meetings, which confirmed the active participation of Gregory Foster and Michael Sanders in these events. Later, I found records of new experiments planned in secret laboratories. I realized that these laboratories could be connected to the terrible experiments that I had found earlier. The next day, I went to another location on the map that was marked as a research center. It was a small room on the edge of the forest that looked like a small laboratory. I cautiously approached the building and saw that the door was not locked. I went inside and came across old laboratory equipment and technical devices. In the corner of the room, I found even more documents that indicated new tests and experiments. It turned out that these studies were part of an even larger project. I began looking through the documents and came across several notes relating to Gregory Foster's personal interests and commitments. They contained details about his research and connections with other scientists involved in the project. I was able to find old human test reports and documentation of psychological testing. They confirmed my suspicions that these experiments were aimed at manipulating human consciousness and behavior. After several days of investigating and gathering information, I felt that I was getting closer to solving the mystery. I decided to check out one of the last places on the map, an old hospital that had closed years ago. It was a huge building with numerous corridors and rooms. I got inside and found the hospital in a state of disrepair. I began to search the premises and came across several old offices in which documents and medical records were stored. Among these documents, I found records of patients who had been subjected to experiments. I discovered that the hospital was also part of a network of research centers doing the same experiments. The records confirmed that these experiments were aimed at studying the control of consciousness and behavior, as well as the manipulation of the mental state of people. I found several videos on which the research and the results of the experiments were recorded. These were horrific scenes that showed that many people fell victim to these merciless tests. When I finally got back to town, I tried to contact James again, hoping to get support and help. He responded, and I decided to meet with him to share what I had learned. We met in one of the cafes, and I told James about all my finds. He was shocked by what I found out and agreed to help me with the investigation. Together, we began to plan the next steps, including trying to solve these crimes and find ways to stop further experiments. Our goal was clear: We had to gather all the evidence and submit it to law enforcement to stop this horrific activity. I felt that we were getting closer to the solution, but I also knew that it would be a dangerous and difficult road. With the collected evidence and a new plan, we set out to fight the darkness that was intertwined with the history of these experiments. We knew that more dangers could await us, but we were also prepared for it because our investigation was getting closer to revealing the terrible truth.